Right, well, we're going to talk about risk. And the important thing to understand about risk in the modern world is how the modern world is changing its profile for us. So our lives are now incredibly complex. They're interdependent. Our companies are becoming complex, completely interconnected. Our societies like that. And to really understand the pace of that difference, you can take a very simple example. So one of the things I like to do is understand how different cohorts of age are interacting with technology. And you can find some very sharp differentiators. So for example, there'll be certain social media terms that are used by one age group and not another. But one of the ones that's very powerful are the people like me who are old enough to have lived through proper power cuts. So those of you that are my age remember the 70s when the lights went out. And the interesting thing about that was it actually wasn't that bad in the sense of you huddled around a candle and then after 5 or 6 hours the lights came back on, the fridge started again and everything carried on. But even that can't be conceived of people who haven't lived through it. Then we went to an age where when that happened, you suddenly had to run around and reset all the digital clocks. Now, when that happens, everything grinds to a halt. And if you're in charge of a server room, it will take you hours to get that back up once the batteries have run out on the servers. It happened to me recently, and my 8-year-old daughter was very interested in the idea that the electricity had gone off and then couldn't understand the fact that the Wi-Fi didn't work. That's the complexity that we have, one thing leading to another. And one of the biggest areas where this has become concern is in the financial area, and there are two risks. One is a stability risk, and the other is a sort of cyber threat risk. And what we've been doing now is we've sort of seen the problem, and we wanted to create something that makes us feel safer. And this is the sort of fairy tale castle model. So the idea being that if we can get enough Lego bricks from the IT vendors, we can put them together and we can make a wall, and the wall will be big enough and it will keep whoever's defined as bad out and all the good stuff inside, and we can sort of pat ourselves on the back that this works. And most of the approach up to now has been like that, and one of the reasons for it is that people want an absolute answer. They want to be able to sleep at night. And the idea here is as long as you build the wall big enough and strong enough and you make sure all the gaps are closed, you're going to be safe. And the problem with that model is it's absolutely a non-starter in the modern interconnected, interdependent world. Every morning through those walls, you allow a large number of insiders. For a modern company to work, it has to be connected to its suppliers and to its customers. There is no option. To thrive, you have to be connected, you have to be dependent on each other. And any one of those employees coming in can either wittingly or unwittingly be an insider. You know, to give you a little piece of information that's now suitably out of date, about a year ago, one of the most efficient ways of breaching a corporate network was to get a CD-ROM, and all you had to do was write on it salary review details and leave it in the company car park. And that had about a 90% chance of getting a piece of code onto the network because someone would just put that in a drive and have a go and see what they could find out about people's salary reviews. The methods continually change, but it's now the case that if someone really wants to get into almost any organization, it's almost impossible to stop. And the reason is that you have to be interconnected. So if we go back to that castle model, the reason we have that model is because in history that's what developed. You go to Italy and you see those beautiful Tuscan hill towns. They're on the top of a hill and they have a big castle wall. And the model worked because pretty much everyone in the town was in the same family. But those towns are now quaint little backwaters. And modern Milan is the place that's successful because it's all about interaction. And it's the same with us as human beings. There are two creatures in the world that devote the most of their metabolic resources to protecting themselves. The first one's a crocodile, and if you think about that, that's because it's got to sort of wrestle with wildebeest in muddy waters and that sort of thing, gets bashed around a lot. The second are human beings. And the reason is that we gain a massive advantage by the fact that we stay in the same place every night, we don't move around like chimpanzees, that we interact in bigger groups, that we keep animals, So the important point here is that the very thing that the digital revolution is giving us is inherently linked with what gives us risk. They're not separable. And in fact, it's the natural world that can give us some idea about how we really ought to be thinking about this. Ever since life on the planet started, it's been under attack. As soon as a single cell has a resource that can be taken over and used, it's under attack. Our DNA is nothing other than information. It's under attack. It's been infiltrated. It's been taken over by real-world viruses all the time. And our approach to that has been to do the obvious things. We have a skin, which is rather like that wall. But we would die very, very quickly if we were relying on our skin to keep us protected. What we have is something far more marvelous, which is an immune system. And the immune system is something that can learn to handle something completely unseen, completely new by what it does. And so no matter how something gets into us, through a cut, through our nose, through something we eat, we have the ability to be protected. That's an uncomfortable thought, because it says we are always going to be infiltrated. And the reality now, when you go in and you do an analysis, is 80% of the FTSE 100 is infiltrated at a level that means that someone could take over control of that network and that company. The kind of level we see with something like the Sony hack that you saw before, 80%. So the reality is it's almost impossible to keep everything out. What you have to do is assume that it's going to get in, because there are so many ways of getting in. So if we take the approach of assuming that we can't sleep at night and stuff's going to get in, what do we need in order to make a system that could start to deal with this problem in the way that an immune system does? Well, the amazing thing that your immune system does is when you're in the womb, it learns the difference between self and non-self. And it does that adaptively. It's not programmed. It's something it actually learns as it goes along. And so what it can do then is form that balance of understanding what is normal for what's going on and what is abnormal. And that's exactly what the technologies need to do. And to do that, it's important to catch a cold. You catch a cold, you learn enough about little bits of how a virus will behave. But you don't, like the current approaches, for example, like virus checkers and malware, need to have seen that virus before. You can learn enough from your encounters with how they behave to actually deal with an unseen one. You'll get a lot sicker, it will take you longer to get better, but with a bit of luck, you won't actually die from it. And why does this work so well? Well, the other approach is to try and create rules. So you say, I don't know, if a big file gets sent out, I want to set off an alarm. But that doesn't work because, let me give you an analogy. If you want to break into a house that has a big burglar alarm, all you have to do is take a little longer. For the previous 3 weeks, you turn up about 2 in the morning, random nights, and you throw stones at the windows till the alarm goes off. After about 3 weeks, the alarm gets turned off. So the important point is, what you've got to understand is, it's no good alarming on things if you get to the point where no one takes any notice. And this is rather like having unworkable security policies. You know, if it's so difficult to send a file to your colleague that you start using Dropbox, then you've sort of undermined the whole thing. Well, the way in which this can be done is by harnessing machine learning. This is the art of machines that actually learn from experience. And the model here is that the machine is put onto the network. It takes about 4 weeks in a normal company, and it learns every device, every server, every operation that's going on, the fact that this particular person sends files to Kazakhstan, this particular device might be sending large video files around, and so it can actually deal with all of those different cases and adapt to them as they go on. But what it can do is notice something which is completely out of the ordinary, something which is wrong. And the important thing about that is, what we are starting to see is no longer the sort of cliche effects of someone, I don't know, defaming a website or stealing credit card numbers. In a sense, that's the least of your problem because you know that's happened. But imagine a piece of code which is injected into a bank. It rears its head for 20 milliseconds every year, and all it does is change by a small amount the balances, and then it goes quiet again. Over time, those balances will go into the backups. They will propagate through the system. And then at one point, it's possible to let the bank know that you can't rely on any of the balances anymore. What you've destroyed is trust. And trust is pretty central to how many of our institutions work. Might not be as obvious as some of the threats we see today, but these things are far more dangerous. Another example is code that just sits there, flick a switch, and you can take down a power station, or you can take down a company, but most of the time, actually doing nothing. So those technologies now exist. I think it's the beginning of a race. We're starting to see machine intelligence used on the other side, people actually doing the attacks, so machines learning how to actually get in, and we're having to fight them with machines. This is very real technology now. We see all sorts of interesting things out there, some of them very worrying, some of them are quite humorous. The best one that we've seen so far is a European bank that had lots of servers, and at night the servers were being hijacked to mine for Bitcoin, which seemed a wonderful use of those servers sort of undermining the banking system. But there's also another problem going on in the financial world, which is just sheer complexity. So Edward Wilson, the biologist from Harvard, has a wonderful quote. He says that we have the emotions of the Paleolithic, so we love and hate and have greed, just as all of the people that literature has written about for the last few thousand years. We have the institutions of the medieval, so things like the nation state, and we have the technology of the gods. And the difficulty is that the technology is moving so fast that the institutions can't keep up. You imagine what we're seeing in the financial system, everything getting faster, more feedback loops, more dependencies, more interconnections. And yet the ability of a regulator to deal with it still moves at human speed. You know, Timothy Geithner still crosses Manhattan at 11 miles an hour, which is what he would have managed 100 years ago. He still has to stare down bank chiefs in a room. Angela Merkel has to deal with the political process to deal with making the Eurozone stable. Yet the technology is getting faster and faster and more complex. And that leads to an inevitable conclusion, which is regulation is no longer going to be capable of being done by human beings after the effect. If you're driving a car at 30 miles an hour, you can take your hands off the wheel, the car will start to go off to one side, you can put your hands back and you can correct it. That's the model we have at the moment. If you're driving that car at 150 miles an hour and you take your hands off the wheel, you're dead. We are moving into that world. And what that leads us to is a very sobering thought, which is as these systems get more and more complex, we're going to see the birth of a new area, which is regulation technology, or RegTech as it's known. And inevitably, I think this is going to be one of the most interesting areas for new technologies, because there's an inevitability about its need. If we want to have the complexity of our modern world, we're going to need to be able to regulate that faster than we humans can do it. But that leads us with one sobering thought, which is that the very effect we're seeing here, which is our dependence on complex systems, means that the only thing that we can turn to for our actual defense are other complex systems. And we're going to have a situation where we're going to have the machines policing the machines. Thank you very much.
Mr. Lynch, explain very briefly about the methodology that Darktrace uses to find these threats.
Well, the first thing to understand is that this world is all about probabilities. So although we'd like to think that everything's black and white and we can spot something as bad or good, it's all about assessing probabilities. And what the system does is it sits there and it watches what goes on in the network over time. So for example, you use an Apple device. That Apple device, you use it for these things. You access these databases. And it can start to understand what you look like and what you do. And then suddenly, if your device starts doing some very strange things, that immediately stands out because it's learned that. And the methods that are used for doing that are the same sort of methods that you see behind all of the changes that machine learning is bringing, from humble Siri up to autonomous cars. It's the same ability to learn by understanding those probabilities from the real world. And as the system gets more experienced, it gets cleverer. And then the other thing that's wonderful about the digital world, of course, is one brain over here that's learning can talk immediately to another and start to compare notes about what they're seeing. And so you actually get this sort of multiplication of the knowledge very quickly going on. And the reason this is going to be important is we're starting to see as sophisticated methods coming from the other side, on the attacker side as well. And you know, there the difficulty is noisy attacks are okay. They make headlines, they're worrying. The really dangerous ones are the very quiet ones.
And in the Wired story that we just published, we've got examples of how Darktrace is working with infrastructure organizations trying to protect them. I think we have a photo of the Drax power station. How realistic do you think it is that we can protect our national infrastructure from attacks from, you know, the Chinese, the criminals?
Well, again, I think it means what you mean by attack. And I think the reality, although it's very unpalatable to say this, it's almost impossible to guarantee you will not be infiltrated. What you need to do is make sure that that infiltration can't actually do any actions that are going to cause you a problem. So if you like, the old thinking was somehow we were going to have a perfect wall and assume that nothing got past it. Now the thinking is much more like the reality of my life and your life. I'm afraid I have bacteria in my nose and I have viruses in my bloodstream, but the reason I'm managing to stand up straight still is that I can keep those under control. I can keep them not doing things that I don't want them to. I think realistically, although we might not like it, that's more the model that we're going to have to see going forward.
And finally, tell us a bit more about how you're spending your time these days. So explain what Invoke is doing and how much time Darktrace is taking.
Well, what happened over my sort of previous years in technology is I was lucky enough to work with a sort of wonderful group of people, and they followed my wonderful rule of always being different to you. So you always try and find people that know about other things like marketing and all that sort of stuff. We did Autonomy. We sold that. The environment that was sold into didn't work for a lot of those people, and they left. And now we're back together. And what we do now is we look for people that we have got something really fundamentally clever. That's what we know about. And because we've done this a few times before, we look for things that could be very big. And then our goal really is to help the people doing that to make different mistakes to the ones that we've already made. It's basically doing tech, but only having to do the fun bits, which is really nice.
Thank you for sharing.
Thanks
Mike
very
Lynch.
much.